Hey guys, Matthew here, and today is going to be a little bit of a different video. Today is going to be the first theoretical video on this channel, and the topic here will be really important, and that is training form. This is something that I wanted to explain for a very long time, and yeah, today is the day, and today I'm going to be explaining training form to you guys, what it is, how to use it, why I use it, the benefits, the drawbacks, and the implementation in the training. So here we go. This topic is really important and I'm really excited to be sharing it with you guys. So let's get to it. Let's first answer the question, what is training form? And the best way to put it is basically training form is the form you use when you are training. Let's contrast it with competition form. So when you are competing, when you are in a competition with the judges, which hold you accountable to the standards that are written in the rulebook, there are certain standards for your performance, and they are, as I said, written in the rulebook. So you have to perform exactly as written, and that includes following the commands and being super strict. But in training, following the strictest of guidelines is sometimes not that optimal. If we are talking strictly competition form, then even if you are not following commands for each rep you do, that's already not competition form. That's a deviation. So my point here is that everyone uses training form, not just me, everyone. No one is performing the reps exactly the same in training as they would in competition. That's just the standard. So, with that, let's discuss what makes for optimal training form. And that is where things get more interesting, because this is where we get to the compensations. So, optimal training form is the form that allows you to make the fastest progress while minimizing the effort spent on unnecessary things. For example, following commands for every rep in training is completely unnecessary and over the top. That's why no one does it. So that's an optimization. And if you really think about it, you can always find a way to execute a movement that will mean the fastest progress while also cutting out some unnecessary strictness that is present in competition required form. And you can think of that as building raw strength. So in competition, you show strength, like clean strength, the strength to the comp standard. But in training, you need to build raw strength first. Strength that is unbound by strict rules, and basically means just your ability to move weight. No matter how, just move weight. And once you have built up this foundation of raw strength, you can consider it as an uncut diamond you find in a mine somewhere. So you build up this foundation, you make this diamond bigger, 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 and then once you have enough raw strength, you can then cut and polish it with competition form training, and in the end you will have a much bigger diamond than if you were to train with just competition form from the start. That's the idea here. So with training form, with compensation, like not being so strict, you can build up a lot of raw strength faster than if you were to do just competition form, because you are free of those limitations of the competition form, and you can simply make faster progress. That's it. This of course comes with some drawbacks, which I'll discuss later, but the idea is this. And in practice, it works really well. And the other thing about training form is convenience. So for competition form, you have to control a lot of things. You have to keep in mind a lot of things. And sometimes this kind of overthinking leads to a loss of focus on the important stuff being force production and progress in raw strength. And with training form, you have a great opportunity to just set all that aside and focus on actually getting stronger. And street lifting is a strength sport, so getting stronger This video is sponsored by King of Weighted. If you need a proper dip belt, daisy chain for it, elbow sleeves, knee sleeves, or anything street lifting related, you can buy it on King of Weighted website. The link will be in the description. And additionally, you can use my discount code ZLAT to get a 5% discount off your order. This way, you help grow street lifting and you help me. So, if you need anything concerning street lifting equipment, use King of Weighted. Thank you. Right, so now we know what training form is. Let's now see some examples of it. And the most obvious example is my pull-ups. A lot of people ask me why my pull-ups are not clean, why I have so many compensations, and the answer is simply, it's easier for me to build strength this way, just easier. And let's talk a little bit about what exactly I do with my pull-ups and what is the difference between my training form and competition form. So a lot of people talk about kipping, but that's actually not the main compensation in my pull-up form. The main compensation I make, the main difference between competition standard and my pull-ups is height. And it really adds the most kilos to my training sets. So what I mean is, in competition you have to get your chin clearly above the bar, but in training I count reps which are just touch. So if I feel my chin touching the bar just very slightly, and even touching with the top, with the very top of my chin, the lowest part of the bar, yes, I still consider it a rep, because I moved the weight all the way from the dead hang to the bar. Not over the bar, but to the bar, and that's okay for me, and that's a rep, and that's what adds the most kilos to my pull-up compared to training form. Now, the second thing I use is, of course, the kipping, or I would say leg bending, because kipping, I never kip on purpose. I do have leg bending, sometimes it's abrupt, but I never kip on purpose. I just do not control my legs when I pull. And that turns into bending and sometimes actual kipping, in competition, described in competition rule books as kipping, but I never do that on purpose. It's just what my legs do when I'm not controlling them on purpose. And the third thing that is not allowed in competition form, but I do anyway, is stretch reflex abuse. So this is done at the bottom, and basically what it is that before I start a pull-up, in the dead hang, I don't just pull from the dead hang. Instead, I go a little bit forward in an abrupt motion like this, and I generate a bit of stretch reflex, and then it launches me up a little bit, and this also helps. So these are the three main compensations I have in my pull-up. And what they allow me to do is that they allow me to, first of all, save strength in each rep, so I can get more reps in. And that goes for height and leg movement. And the second thing that is important is that they allow me to start the pull-up and pull through as explosively as possible. This is about stretch reflex and the leg movement again, because if I were to completely avoid using stretch reflex and completely avoid bending my legs, I would actually have to do a kind of a tempo pull. So I'll have to slow down a little bit, and in my subjective experience, this feels as just a slower pull-up. And pulling slow is super suboptimal for developing strength. For actually getting more raw strength, you need to be as explosive as possible, and for me that means compensating. Simple as that. So I could either try to do all of my training to competition standard, but it will make me weaker. And I actually ran a little bit of an experiment a bit earlier in this training block, and for originally I wanted to run at least a whole block of just competition pull-ups, but after 2.5 weeks, just 2.5 weeks, I already started feeling that I'm getting weaker, and even 70 kilos, which is a joke weight for me usually, was heavy. So I ditched that, and currently I'm recovering my strength from this experiment with training form. So yeah, basically The idea here is that I cannot be explosive enough and I cannot have enough force production if I'm focused on keeping my form super clean as in competition standard. So that's why I actually have to use training form in order to get stronger, because without it I just cannot explode enough. So that's about my pull-ups, and that's why I'm doing what I'm doing. A second good example would be my dips. And I actually was thinking that I would have absolutely no issues dipping to a comp standard in an actual competitions, because all of my 1 rep maxes were done perfectly to comp standard. But when it actually came to competing, I faced some issues with hip depth, because I have this issue where I cannot get enough hip depth on lighter weights. So the weight is easy to move, but there is just not enough weight for my hips to go down enough without me actually trying to hit hip depth consciously. So why I don't hit hip depth consciously? Because that's just the way my movement pattern developed over the years, and at this point it would be too difficult for me to rebuild this from scratch. And I actually tried it, and I will actually, like, to rebuild my dip for every rep to be hip depth to comp standard, I would have to do tempo dips for a while, just tempo dips, and this will make me massively weaker, and I'll have to spend months just rebuilding my strength to the point where it was. So instead I am doing training form for my heavy sessions, and I'm practicing hip depth with lighter weights and post reps on light sessions. And that's the implementation of training form I'm going to discuss a little bit later in this video. But anyway, not hitting hip depth allows me to actually have a faster negative, especially on my rep sets, because to bring down the hips I will have to slow down the negative a bit, and I cannot afford to do that because it will pump me really fast and I have no endurance. My rep work actually sucks compared to my 1 rep max because I have no endurance, and if I want to hit all reps with proper hip depth I will have to slow down, and my endurance will be even worse this way. So I have to actually stick to that. And another thing that differs my normal dips from competition is the entry, because in a lot of competitions, in final rep specifically, everyone uses box entry and I have side steps available. So why would I waste my strength on an inferior entry on my important sessions when I can just enter super efficiently and not waste any strength? That's the second difference. And the third difference is that I don't really hold my dip before I start the set. So in a competition you have to actually hold a little bit waiting for the command before you descend, and I don't do that in training. Of course, no one does, almost no one does, and that also makes a little bit of a difference. So these are the compensations I have with my dip form, and these are actually pretty common. And then there is even a thing called Dutch dip, where the guys in training do like super exaggerated forward lean and crunch and protraction, and in my experience the Dutch dip is actually really useful, and all of my warm-up sets and my lighter rep sets with not a lot of weight, they look super Dutch as well. This is for dips. Now let's discuss some other athletes, what they do. And a very interesting example of training form is current training of Ruslan Fatahov and his usage of resistance band. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, Ruslan Fatahov is the best athlete, like the strongest athlete when it comes to weighted endurance, especially in pull-ups. His best result was 32 kilo pull-ups for 35 reps. And currently he is practicing all of his lifts with a thin rubber band, and I'll attach a video here as an example of what I mean. But right now he does all of his sets with a light rubber band, so weighted with a band. And he says that it increased his progress a lot, and not just due to the band helping him, but to the actual feedback he has on the band tension. And due to this, and also due to the easier swing control with the band, he was able to gain raw strength much faster with this form. So that is a great example of using training form, just equipment wise, and it definitely gave him great results, because with this bended approach he actually managed to hit 100 kilo chin-ups for 6 reps, starting at only 2 reps as far as I can remember, and this progress was done in just a couple of months. So insane raw strength gain from using this kind of training form, and that's what it's useful for. But training form can actually be even harder than competition form. So the idea for training form is to use the form that gives you the most progress, and for some people it's using compensations and using easier form like myself. For some people, actually it makes sense to use harder and stricter rules than even competitions have to progress. A good example of this would be Artem Shirokov and his smooth pulls. So if you know Artem, his pull-ups tend to have this very pronounced double motion, where he first starts in the dead hang, first he goes here, has a little bit of a stop, and then finishes the closing. And for a long time he did just that, double motion pull-ups, and that's it. But at some point he got stuck, and his idea to break through this barrier was to use pull-ups in one motion. So what he had to do was to start a little bit slower, but finish the pull-up in one smooth motion. And he quickly got stronger at those, and they had insane carryover to his 1 rep max and double motion pull-ups. And this way he broke through all the way from like a 90 kilo 1 rep max to dirty 110 in like 2 or 3 months, as far as I can remember. It was in 2020 or 2021, so quite a long time ago. But this is a good example of training form being harder than your normal form, harder than competition form, and yet bringing superior results. And this actually strengthens the idea that training form, the efficient training form, is the form that gives you the most progress. It can be harder than competition form, it can be easier than competition form, but the idea is to find the kind of execution that drives your progress the fastest, not looking at any outside standards presented to you by the world. So let's now discuss the benefits of using training form. I covered it a little bit before, but let's actually discuss it specifically, directly. And the first benefit is, of course, fast progress and carry over to your competition form results. This is the main reason why would you do training form in the first place, for maximum progress. As I said before, having the standards and the limitations of competition form can sometimes slow you down and not allow you to progress as fast as you would like to, because you will have to not count the reps that are not to competition standard. But with training form, you can count those reps and therefore increase the weight faster, add reps faster, and overall push more volumes, more weight, which leads to more progress. And the idea here would be that the faster progress in raw strength will also carry over to your competition form results, and the progress itself will be faster than if you were to use just competition form. That's why training form has to have fixed standards. So let's use my pull-ups as an example. I have downgraded my chin height rule from chin over the bar to chin touching the bar. Yes, and that allows me to add weight faster. But if I don't touch the bar, that's still a no rep. Simple as that. So even though you're using an easier sometimes form for your training, you still have to have strict standards, or else your sets will become incomparable. And at the start of a block you may use stricter form, and by the end of a block you might use much more loose form with more weight, but the raw strength will stay unchanged, and that's not progress, that's just stalling. So your training form has to have standards in order to have measurable carryover to your competition form. But as long as you have standards, usually the carryover is pretty reliable. So in my case, my training form 1 rep max is usually around 10 to 12 kilos lower than training form. So I can reliably say that if my dirty training form 1 rep max has progressed by 10 kilos, that my competition form 1 rep max has also progressed by 10 kilos, because the ratio stays basically the same. And that's what you should be aiming for when you are training with training form. Reliable carryover. That's the benefit number 1. Benefit number 2 is more power output. So as I said with my pull-ups, if I don't use stretch reflex, I will have to consciously slow myself down, and that will hurt my muscle recruitment. So I'll have to turn on at the beginning of the movement, not at 100%, but rather at 75%, and that will hurt my power output. And with training, with aiming to maximize my raw strength gain, I have to be able to pull at 100%. And for me, pulling at 100% requires using a stretch reflex. That's it. So this way I maximize my power output, not just at the bottom, but through the whole motion. And not just my bottom part becomes stronger, but my middle part and the closing also becomes stronger this way. So that's power output. Superior power output, that's number 2 when it comes to benefits. And the third point is not physical, but it's not less important, not any less important because of that, is morale boost. And this is tricky. This goes very close to the point of ego lifting. But what I mean here is that when you have lifted heavy weights using training form, you'll feel much more confident hitting lighter weights, but with competition form, because you will not register these lighter weights as impressive. So for example, in training leading up to German Open, max pull-up I did was 125, very dirty training form. And in competition I did 112.5, and this was after muscle ups, so with a little bit of fatigue. So I'd say the difference between my training max and my competition max was around 10 kilos. So 10 kilos of just weight drop because of the form, and 2.5 kilos due to fatigue from muscle ups. And the thing is that 112 wasn't even perceived by me as heavy. So I've pulled multiple pre-fatigued singles of 112.5, even 115 in my training. So when I came fresh building up in competition, 112.5 was something that wasn't even it wasn't even impressive for me. It was just I can do it easily. But the key part was doing it in competition form, of course, which I did successfully. But I was ready mentally to pull that weight, because in training I handled much heavier weights, but with training form. And that's what I'm talking about when it comes to morale boost. So it's much easier to break through mental limits using training form than competition form. That's just the truth. And it's true not only for 1 rep max, but also for weighted sets, for endurance sets, for example. It's a common thing for people to do a 20-20-20, so the silver set, for example, to first do it dirty form, just to mark it as done in your head. And then it will be much easier mentally for you to repeat it with cleaner form once you know you can do it. And the same here is with 1 rep max. So when you know you can do the weight, when you know you can do more, then it's much easier mentally for you to reach that weight with competition form. And you do not have to feel like you're breaking some kind of barrier, because you have already broken that in your mind. And you know you're strong enough to hit that. It just has to be a bit cleaner. That's it. So we discussed the benefits of training form. Now let's discuss the drawbacks, because they are obvious. And the first and the most obvious drawback is specificity. So it's logical that if you are preparing for a competition, that training form is not as specific for improving performance as competition form. And another issue which comes with the specificity is the faulty movement pattern. So if you get super used to using compensations in your training form, like leg movement, like stretch reflex, then when you have to perform with competition form, it might be super hard and super challenging for you to get rid of those faulty movement patterns. And there is a chance that, for example, on your opener, on your lighter attempts, you'll have no problem competing clean, but when the weights go up and when you have a heavy attempt, your habitual movement patterns can resurface and ruin your rep. And that's definitely a possibility, but there is a way to work around that, and I'll talk about this later on when I will be discussing the implementation of training form in the actual training process. So the drawback number one is the faulty movement pattern and the specificity question. The specificity question is negated by the great carryover you have from training form to competition form, and the faulty movement pattern is negated by practicing competition form on separate days, as I did and as I will explain. So there are ways to circumnavigate both of those drawbacks. So the point number two is injury risk, and that is the point that is super common to discuss, especially like people in the comments say that you might get injured if you push yourself with bad form. And the answer here is yes, sometimes you may have more injury risk with training form. If you, for example, pull super heavy with compromised form on chin-ups, there will be a higher risk of, for example, a bicep tear. And this happened to me, I know what I'm talking about. And this is where standards come into play, the standards which I described before. So when you are using training form, you have to have standards. And these standards are not only for like accountability and comparability of the sets, but also to prevent injury risk. So when I was doing a lot of non-stop dirty chin-ups, it wore down my bicep tendon quickly and it tore. So now my training form is all dead stop. So when I do chin-ups, when I do pull-ups, I do all of my reps dead stop, and that's the part of my training form now. And that is the standard that prevents me from getting injured again in the same manner. So the injury risk here is circumnavigated by having strict standards and not breaking them and not pushing through them. And of course, if you want to eliminate any injury risk, the priority number 0 for you should be load management. So if you're pushing too much load with too much frequency, then you're asking for an injury. And with training form, it's easier to push more load and more volume, and you have to be careful and manage that properly and give yourself enough recovery so that you don't beat yourself up, because with handling heavier weights it is easier to beat yourself up. So you have to be careful, and the injury risk is definitely a factor here and a definite drawback which you have to keep in mind when you use training form. And the last drawback I want to discuss is moral compromise. And that is the thing where you feel somehow inferior in a way that your form is not clean, therefore you're doing like a worse job, so to say. So this point, from my position, from the way I see it, is completely wrong. And this idea of that dirty form is somehow morally inferior to clean form comes from the understanding that using dirtier form is a way to cheat yourself from hard work. So the idea is that if you do your reps clean, you're putting in more work, and making your reps dirty is somehow making your training easier, and that is morally inferior. And I'm here to say that it's like in reality it's completely the opposite. And training form, in its idea as I'm presenting here, is a tool that actually allows you to train harder, not easier. With competition form, you will have to stop when your reps break down, when your form breaks down and you cannot continue to the same standard. But with training form, guess what? Nothing has ended yet. It's still your fucking set. You have to continue. As long as you have that power in you to push through. Maybe not as clean, maybe not as perfect, maybe not to a competition standard, but you still can push. And you push. And you can actually train harder with training form. And you know what? In my vision, training harder is the morally superior thing. So don't let yourself be led into the idea that training form is somehow morally inferior and competition form is somehow morally superior. As long as you push yourself, as long as you go hard, you are doing a great job. And training form will allow you to actually do an even better job of pushing yourself to and beyond your limits. And in this regard, I believe that training form, when used right, is actually it can be even morally superior to just using competition form. Alright, so we discussed what training form is, we discussed the examples, we discussed the benefits, we discussed the drawbacks. Now it's time for the finishing part of this video, the implementation of the training form in your training. And I'll describe the way I do it, and you can try to do it yourself or you can do something different. But basically in my training, what I do is I do the heavy sessions with training form, but I also have to have practice for the competition style movements, because if you don't have practice with competition form, when you actually have to compete, your faulty movement patterns will take over and you will not complete a single clean competition standard rep and go home with nothing. So the way I combine things is I do my primary heavy sessions, whether it's volume or peaking, with training form, and then I have dedicated lighter sessions with competition form and sometimes even exaggerated competition form. So for pull-ups, that would be my main volume work with training form, so chin to bar, no leg control, stretch reflex. And on my lighter sessions, which are once a week during volume phases, I practice competition form with extra height. So I do perfectly straight legs, I do no stretch reflex, and I pull not just chin over bar, but usually neck to bar. And that is my light sessions. And the main benefit of practicing competition form on lighter sessions is that on lighter sessions you don't actually have to push yourself anywhere close to failure. So instead of pushing yourself and having form breakdown and borderline reps between competition and training form, you can actually focus on perfect execution, force production, while having the limitations of comp form applied, and that is super useful for actual competition performance. And for dips currently, I am working on my hip depth. So when I'm doing my dip volume, I do everything as always, so not controlling hip depth really and going super fast. But on my lighter sessions, I do paused dips. And the recent implementation is that I'm now doing all of my paused work with a box entry, so as they do in competition. And that gives me enough practice to actually have my box entry sharp and ready for competition, so that I don't waste almost any strength when I have to switch from side steps to box entry. And super recently, after German Open, I also do all of my paused dips with strict hip depth, so the lower part of the belt below the dip bars. And I'm really building that movement pattern so that I can use it in competition later. And the key in this approach is that you treat training form sessions and competition form sessions as completely separate movements. So I'm not just training dips, I'm training two kinds of dips. Training form, where I go no hip depth, super fast reps, but then later on in 1 rep max, my weight that is on the belt is enough to push my hips all the way below the dip bars, so my 1 rep maxes are actually pretty close to competition form. And then on lighter sessions, I actually do exaggerated competition form. So not only just box entry and hip depth, but I also do pause reps there. So I don't just bring my hips all the way below the dip bars, but I also pause there. And that's how I build a robust movement pattern that lasts and that withstands load in competition. And I got some questions of people asking how to combine training form and competition form, and their idea was to do them all in one session. And I would say that's super inefficient, because you have to divide these movement patterns. You have to consider this as two separate variations of one lift. So it's not just dips this way or that way. These are two separate movements. These are, for example, training dips and competition dips. Same goes for pull-ups. I consider them as two completely different lifts. So my training pull-ups and my competition pull-ups are done on different days, and they don't intersect inside one session. And I consider them as completely different movements with different strength levels and different PRs. So if I hit, for example, 100 for 6 weighted pull-ups training form, and then I hit, for example, 80 kilos for 6 competition form, both are PRs. Even though it's still pull-ups, even though it's still for 6 reps, both are PRs, because training form and competition form are just different movements, different lifts. That's the way I treat it, and that's the way that allows me to have my movement pattern robust and not breaking down in competition. And I actually had the chance to practice it, and all 3 of my pull-ups were valid reps in German Opens. So yeah, my approach with practicing competition form definitely withstood the practice test, and that's how I did it. So I split my sessions into training form and competition form, and I never do both kinds of form on the same day. It is, however, possible to swap these and do, for example, heavier sessions with competition form and lighter sessions with a kind of training form. But this approach would work if your training form is harder than your competition form, as Artyom, for example, did. So he had his training sessions with 2 motion pull-ups as heavy ones, and then he had his training, so non-standard form of smooth pull-ups as his assistance / stricter form work. So this like, to summarize this approach, you do the form that allows you to lift heavier on heavier sessions, and you do the form that allows you to have more control and the stricter kind of form on lighter sessions. So if your training form is easier than your competition form, then you do heavy sessions with training form and lighter sessions with competition form. If it's vice versa, if your training form is harder than your competition form, then you do heavy sessions with competition form, and then lighter sessions with modified training form that is harder than your competition form. And this way you get both competition form practice and powerful carryover from your training form. And that is my approach to handling training form, and that's how I use it. That's how I would use it if I was to coach some athletes to a competition. And that's basically it for this video. And always remember that there is no morally superior form or morally inferior form. When it comes to training, everything, like every way that you can do things, is just a tool in your toolbox. And abstaining from using a little bit dirtier form when it can actually have insane carryover to your strength and progress is not morally superior, it's just stupid. Be a wise athlete and use your toolbox to the fullest. See you in the next video.